Professor Wolf, what does history teach us about universal truth?
Well, thank you for asking me that question. I happen to have a few thoughts prepared. First of all, I want to talk just briefly about that term agnostic. It comes from a Greek root, and then gnosis, and basically means without knowledge. So I stand before you completely ignorant. Actually, it's more specific than that. It's without knowledge, in this case, about God. The man who invented the term was speaking specifically about his ability to understand God. And so I admit before you now, I have no knowledge about God. I don't say that out of hubris. I don't say it out of any form of pride. It's utter humility. From my perspective, looking up, I don't have the eyes that would be necessary to be able to see and understand exactly what's out there. And that's why I consider myself an agnostic. I have no knowledge of God. So then you ask, well, how is it that someone with no knowledge of God pretends to be a scholar of religion? And that's a very good question. And that would be an even better question if religion had that much to do with God. But religion doesn't really have that much to do with God. Religion actually isn't about knowledge about God. It's about how people think and behave when they believe that there is a God. Religion is, in that sense, a very human thing. In fact, I would argue that you can take God out of religion and it will work just fine. But if you take people out of religion, there's really not going to be anything there. Even if there is a God, if there is no attempt somehow to understand Him, communicate with Him, live your life according to Him or her, then what point is there? So human beings are really crucial in this process, and they're really the definitive factor in defining what religion is. And that makes religion a cultural subject. And as a result, somebody like me, a historian driven by anthropological interest, is just all over that, because culture is really what I do. So, that having been said, we begin to address this first question, and we'll do so briefly because we're each allowed 8 minutes to do so, and I've already used up probably 3. So the question, what does history teach us about universal truths? And my own approach to history and my own understanding of history, going way back now into the late 90s as a subject of study, it's really taught me that there is exactly one universal truth in history, and that is that human beings collectively and constantly construct and reconstruct cultures that give direction and meaning to their lives. And that's a really important concept to keep in mind. Every culture has one job, and that job is to provide people within that particular culture with a context and some sort of guidance for how to live their lives in a way that allows them to benefit from living in society and having a bunch of people working toward the same goal. And at the same time to do so with a minimum of tension, psychological tension and social tension. In other words, they get along with one another and they feel reasonably good about the sacrifices they have to make to work together. Cultures tend to work better when they're accepted as if they were simply the way things are, rather than being regarded as constructed by the people who are involved in that culture to begin with. So as a result, cultures generally have a built-in capacity for making people forget that those cultures were humanly produced. That's really where religion comes in. Religion could be defined from this kind of a perspective as that part of culture that provides some kind of an absolute or universal grounding for culture that discourages members from ever thinking outside of that cultural box, from ever trying to look behind the curtain to see the wizard. He's not even there, just don't even think about him. That's really what cultures do. And so if I were to ask myself then, what's the universal truth that history teaches me then, I would have to say that that universal truth is that each culture essentially spawns a religion and spawns a religion with very specific pragmatic purposes as far as the culture is concerned, regardless of what people within that particular culture think is really happening. And so the one universal feature, the one thing that history teaches you is universal, is precisely that cultural production and religion as a subset of that cultural production.